We've already discussed on this channel what would happen if a president tried to continue running the show after January 20th by just refusing to leave office. But today, we're talking about the ways in which a president could stay in office by creating a situation, domestically or globally, that would allow him to stay in power. Things like declaring a national emergency, claiming the country's at war, or even using martial law, all to delay an election or hold on to power just a little longer. It sounds like something out of a political thriller, but in tense times, people are asking, could this actually happen in America? I get these comments all the time, and I get requests to make this video often as well, so here we are. And while the truth is complicated, the law is not.
Check it out.
So buckle in. We are about to answer these questions once and for all. The first thing to know is this. The US Constitution sets a hard stop for every presidential term. This, may I remind you, is the supreme law of the land, the same document that both grants certain powers to the president and limits what a president can do. The 20th Amendment, Section 1 states, "The terms of the president and vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January." That's not flexible, there's no exception. Not for war, not for pandemics, not even if an election hasn't been decided yet. Once the clock hits noon on January 20th, the sitting president is no longer president. They lose all authority, military, executive, everything. So let's see how this plays out in each individual scenario. Alright, for starters, what if the country is at war? Surely then, an election could be delayed, right? Or the transfer of power might not happen, but nope. Even during war, the Constitution doesn't allow a president to stay in power past the end of their term. Authority will transfer regardless. And may I remind you, this has happened many times before in our past. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864. You know, when the nation was literally split in two, 11 states were in open rebellion, and Union troops were fighting major battles on American soil. And yeah, the Union states still held elections. Heck, even Union soldiers voted from the front through absentee ballots, which was the first time this happened in US history. The war itself was no cause for the transfer of power to be postponed. If anything, it's an even greater reason to have an election, so that candidates for the executive office can share their plans to the American voter on how they will deal with the current war. To give you one more example, during World War II, this same thing happens with FDR in 1944, while millions of US troops were overseas. Even then, no delay, no extension. The election happens as usual. If the US could hold elections during a civil war and a world war, it's safe to say it can hold them during almost anything. Alright, let's try this one. What if, before January 20th, the president just declares a national emergency? Could that be used as an excuse to stay in power or cancel an election? Under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, a president can declare a national emergency when there's a serious threat, like a war, natural disaster, or terrorist attack. That declaration unlocks certain special powers Congress has approved in advance. And there are more than 120 of these emergency powers scattered across different federal laws, ranging from freezing foreign assets to redirecting military resources. And I see you panicking right now in your boots. But here's the critical point. None of those laws that give emergency power allow a president to delay an election, extend their term, or ignore the Constitution. Again, we refer to the 20th Amendment. This right here, this is not flexible. There's no emergency clause, no unless there's a crisis, and no if the president says so addendum. These do not exist. At noon on January 20th, the president's term ends, period, whether or not emergency powers have been activated. The framers of the Constitution were very deliberate about this. When the Constitution was written in 1787, the framers had one overwhelming goal: to make sure America would never have a king again. They had just fought a revolution against a ruler who stayed in power for life, King George III. And they wanted to make sure no American leader could ever do the same. The framers deliberately avoided any emergency or continuity of office clause for the president. They had seen firsthand how European monarchs, and even surprisingly, colonial governors of the time who had used a crisis as an excuse to hold on to power. It's fresh in their brains as they're writing the Constitution, so they left no constitutional pathway for an American president to extend their term. Even though emergency declarations are powerful, they do not override the Constitution, and courts have made that very clear for over a century. Speaking of which, the government is built with checks and balances for moments exactly like this. Congress can end a national emergency through a joint resolution. And if a president ever tried to use emergency powers to interfere with an election or stay in office, the Supreme Court could, and almost certainly would, strike it down immediately. And I know what you're going to say.
What?
But believe it or not, party lines do not automatically dictate obedience in Supreme Court rulings. Just because there is a Republican majority in the Supreme Court does not mean every decision they make coincides with Republican belief. Case after case after case proves this. The real thing people should worry about is, what if the election isn't decided by January 20th? That's where Section 3 of the 20th Amendment and the Presidential Succession Act comes in. If no president-elect or vice president-elect has qualified by Inauguration Day, either because the results are being contested, an election was delayed or didn't happen, or some horrific scenario in where there were multiple deaths before January 20th, the law says the Speaker of the House becomes acting president until someone qualifies. If the Speaker can't or won't serve, it passes to the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then down the cabinet line, starting with the Secretary of State. So even if there's no clear winner of the election or no election at all, the system keeps moving. What it doesn't do is allow the old president to just stay put and remain in power. Now, this very scenario has almost happened several times, which is why I think this is the scenario that you need to worry about most. Not for fear of a president staying in power. This can't happen. But for fear that the chain of succession would be followed, putting other potential wild cards into the Oval Office. You may love these guys, you might hate them, but they were not elected to be the executive leader of the nation. They were elected to make laws. And that's a big difference in skill set right there. Anyways, let's look at the closest calls historically. First up is the legendary debacle of the 1800 election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. How much of a debacle, you say? This election resulted in the Constitution being changed immediately after, so yeah, it was bad. Now, because the electoral system at the time did not distinguish between a vote for president and vice president, Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, also received 73 electoral votes, resulting in a tie between Jefferson and Burr. You know, two guys running on the same ticket. With a tie of electoral votes, the election went to the House of Representatives, and it took 36 rounds of voting before Jefferson was finally chosen just 2 weeks before the transfer of power was to take place. If the House hadn't decided in time, there might have been no president on Inauguration Day, as the 20th Amendment wouldn't have been written for another 133 years. Okay, 1800 was good, but 1876 takes the cake. This was an election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Sam Tilden, and this election had it all. In certain states, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, claimed their candidate had won. There were widespread allegations of voter fraud, intimidation, and other irregularities. Now, Congress didn't have a clear constitutional rule for what to do when a state sent multiple different results for an election. So they had to create a special electoral commission, and this commission didn't pick a winner until 2 days before inauguration. For weeks after the election, the US genuinely didn't know who the next president would be. All right, after all of these scenarios, I guess the last thing you're thinking is, couldn't a president just postpone the election? If the election never happens, then no transfer of power can take place, and they can stay in office forever. This is an interesting idea, but absolutely not. Under Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, It's Congress, not the president, that sets the date of the election. Congress uses their power in the United States Code, which fixes the election day as the Tuesday next after the first Monday in November. That date has been the same since 1845, by the way. If anyone wanted to change it, Congress would have to pass a new law, approved by both the House and the Senate, and signed by the president. Even then, the 20th Amendment still says the presidential term ends at noon on January 20th. That means that even if the election were delayed, or the date was changed, the president's term still expires on that date. Alright, in summary, don't forget these fundamental constitutional pillars. 1. The president's term ends at noon on January 20th. No exceptions. 2. Congress, not the president, controls the date of the election. 3. Even during war, disaster, or dispute, the transfer of power still happens. 4. If no one is ready to take office, the Speaker of the House steps in as acting president. And 5. All through American history, elections have never been delayed, and terms have never been extended. So the next time you hear someone say a president could just stay in office, remember, the Constitution says otherwise. At noon on January 20th, the power shifts, whether anyone likes it or not. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.